Greetings, Paul Deeds here. Thought I'd give you a little taste of what it was like growing up in the D in the 50s and 60s, at least as much as I can remember. For the benefit of those of you who don't know much about Michigan or Detroit or the Midwest in particular, Detroit is located in the southeast, basically the southeast corner of Michigan. It's on the Detroit River. Detroit River splits the United States from Canada at that point. A lot of people don't realize the proximity of Canada to Detroit, right across the river. There's a bridge that spans the river, and there's also a tunnel that goes underneath the river. So as a kid, that was kind of exciting, going underneath the Detroit River to get to Canada. At that time, we didn't have cable or satellite or anything like that. We had network television with an antenna on your roof and like that. You've probably seen them, not lately, I'm sure. But anyway, we had an antenna, and in the area that we were in Detroit there, we had 3 stations, channel 2, 4, and 7. There was also a station from Canada, channel 9. As far as radio goes, we had a number of different radio stations depending on the genre of music you like to listen to. And there was also a very popular Canadian radio station, CKLW. I was born in 1949, so that makes me about 75 years old at this particular time. Detroit was pretty much divided into an east side, west side thing. There's also a downriver area that was specific. But you were either a east sider or a west sider for the most part. I mean, there were neighborhoods that had particular names, but it was mostly, like I said, east side or west side. I was a west sider. I was a far west sider, not too far from the suburbs on the west side of the city. The east side was like a different world at that time. My grandparents, my dad's family, my dad's parents, lived on the east side. They were on the near east side. So every once in a while, we didn't go there too often, but when we did, it was like an adventure. It was like going to a different country. And Detroit also has a couple of cities landlocked within the city limits, Hamtramck and Highland Park. And at that time, they were highly ethnic areas. Hamtramck in particular was known for its Polish population. There were other ethnic areas of the city, but I don't know too much about them. At that time, especially in the 50s, my world was pretty small in the city. I mean, we were limited to the areas that you could walk to or ride your bike to. Not that you couldn't ride your bike a distance, of course, but we generally couldn't. There was a time that my dad worked for Ford Motor Company, but I think that was a fairly short-lived period of time, and it was before my memory, might even have been before my birth. I'm not entirely sure. In all of my memory, as far as my memory goes, he was always a Detroit policeman. At the time, there was a residency requirement for the policemen. They had to live within the city to work for the police department. That changed sometime later on. I think it was the late 60s or early 70s that changed. But back in my early memory, you had to live in the city. Also at that time, my earliest memories are my mother worked for the borough's adding machine company. So a machine shop of some sort. I don't know a lot of details about it, but I remember her coming home from work with her hands full of metal slivers. So she was operating some sort of milling machine or something. I don't know exactly. Nothing she was particularly trained for. It was just a factory type job. Working for the police force, my dad worked swing shifts. He'd work some day shifts, and then he'd work some afternoon shifts, and then he'd work some evening shifts. I don't remember exactly how that all worked. I was pretty young at that time. And what I do remember is when he was working the night shifts, was that he would sleep during the day, of course, and that kind of restricted our play areas. We had a small backyard, but the bedroom window his bedroom window was off the backyard. So if we were in the backyard, we had to stay away from his window and keep the noise down and whatnot. So on those particular times, we were generally not in the yard. My grandmother lived with us when we lived in Detroit. That was my mother's mother. She had been divorced for many years. And my earliest memories, she was living with us. She ended up moving back to Wisconsin. She was from Wisconsin, where my mother was from. And she moved back to Wisconsin and had a little house in the town that she grew up in the town my mother was born in. So she moved back there. I don't remember exactly what year that was. As long as I can remember, and to this day, she was probably the finest human being I've ever known. I don't recall her ever raising her voice. I don't recall her ever having a harsh word for anyone. That's pretty tough and pretty rare. She was always my favorite person in the world. And I also have a brother, a little over 2 years older than me. When we were younger, we got along pretty well. When we became teenagers, a little bit less so, like brothers will do. The area of the city we lived in was an area of post-war housing. The houses were all pretty similar and probably a little over a car's width apart. About enough room for a driveway so you could get to your garage in the backyard. Different neighborhoods in the area had different specifics. Our particular area had, most of the houses were shingle-sided, but you'd see an occasional brick house or something like that. And there were neighbors that were just the opposite, that were predominantly brick with an occasional shingle house or an aluminum siding. We got aluminum siding at one point, and that was a big deal. We were strictly a middle-class family. I didn't think too much about it at the time, but looking back on it, that's what we were. And happy to be that. The grade school I went to when I started school was Horace Mann Elementary. And that was about, probably 4 or 5 city blocks from the house. And I walked to school. Early on, I would come home for lunch. There were kids that, I don't know if their parents worked or what their situation was, but they would carry a lunchbox and stay at school for lunch. But I was close enough that I always came home for lunch and then went back and finished out the day in the afternoon. And I remember I had to cross West Chicago to get to school, and that was a busy street, we called it. It was 2 lanes, but it was the street that the cross streets stopped for, and there were lights here and there on West Chicago. And we had a crossing guard from the school. His name was Mr. Redrick. And I remember Mr. Redrick, if you got to the corner before he got there, you could see him coming because he drove this big green Buick. And he drove really slow. You'd be standing on the corner waiting for him to come and cross the kids. And you'd see him coming and coming and coming. And it was comical that he drove so slow. And at the time, we thought of him as being an old guy. He was probably in his 50s. I don't know. I really don't know. People talk these days about how bad social media is and all the negative things about social media. But to be perfectly honest, it has its good points too. And one of those is that a few years ago, I was able to get back in touch with some of my classmates from grade school. Now, how cool is that? And how would you ever be able to do that without the internet, without social media? And there's a handful of us that are back in touch, which is kind of cool. Some old friends from the old days. And I remember back in that time, on the weekends, we would go to the movie show, the theater. And it was the Atlas, the one we went to from our neighborhood was the Atlas Theater. And I would have sworn before I looked up the address on the internet, or Google, yeah, it's the internet. I looked up the address and it was on Plymouth Road. And I would have sworn, I would have bet a substantial amount of money that it was on West Chicago. My memory told me it was on West Chicago, but it wasn't. It was on Plymouth Road. And we used to take the bus, or somebody would drop us off at the Atlas Theater. And I remember that the Saturday matinee was 10 cents, No, Saturday matinee was 15 cents. If you went during the week, it was 10 cents. And Saturday matinee was 15 cents. And that was a double feature with cartoons, with coming attractions, and a newsreel, as I recall. It was a very, very small theater. A little candy counter in the lobby that you could get your candy bars or your nonpareils or your Red Hots or whatever your choice was. Didn't have the choice then that we have now, but I was never a popcorn at the theater guy. I was a candy at the theater guy. And also at that time, from occasionally, not very often, but a couple times a year, we would go down to a Tigers game downtown. We didn't spend a lot of time downtown, but on occasion we would go to a ball game. And that was at Briggs Stadium. It's now Tigers, well, it's now something else entirely, but it changed names from Briggs Stadium to Tiger Stadium before it moved to Ford Field or whatever it is now. I don't even know what it is now. There's kind of an interesting story. I read a lot, and John Grisham is one of my favorite authors. He had a scene in one of his books that was from the past, and it identified or mentioned Tiger Stadium, but it was at a time and a year before it had changed names. Actually, in the time frame of the book, it would have been Briggs Stadium, not Tiger Stadium. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And no, I didn't write him a letter. I'm sure I'm not the only one that noticed it. At least not the only one from Detroit. And when I graduated from grade school, I went to Lessinger Junior High, which was in the other direction. It was west of where I lived. It was also walking distance, and most of the time I walked. Occasionally I would hitchhike, don't tell mom. And I was in one of the first classes when the junior high opened. It was a brand new school when I went there. I was in the second graduating class. At that time in the city, they were graduating 2 classes a year, one in January and one in June. And there was a class that graduated in January, and then I graduated in June. And it was interesting to go to junior high because it expanded my world some. Up until that point, I was kind of limited is a better word, to a certain area around the house. I mean, you could only go so far from the house, and all your friends from grade school were within a certain distance of your house. In junior high, I learned and met people that were outside of my circle, and it was an interesting time because that was my first experience with something larger than my immediate circle. They were like foreigners to me. These people that were from the other side of Joy Road. I didn't know anybody on the other side of Joy Road because we weren't allowed to cross Joy Road. And I didn't know anybody on the other side of Plymouth Road because we just didn't go that way. And after I graduated, a lot of graduating. After I graduated from junior high, I went to CTEC High School in downtown Detroit. CTEC was kind of a prestigious high school. You had to meet certain requirements to get in. It was well known for its arts and science program. I was in architecture, but it's kind of an interesting little tidbit that there were a couple of famous people that graduated from my high school. Diana Ross, for one, attended CTEC. So did Lily Tomlin. Ellen Burstyn, another actress. And I'm told that Malcolm X attended for a while. I don't think he graduated from there, but he attended CTEC for a while. Pretty cool. I was talking earlier about having my horizons widened by going to junior high. Well, going to high school, especially going to this high school, really did that. There were kids from all over the city attending this high school from areas that I knew nothing about. The schools up to that point, the schools I attended, were mostly white students. I lived in a white neighborhood. When I went to Cass, the ratio was probably, and this is just a guess, was probably 60% white, 40% black, I don't remember. And this was during the time of civil rights and whatnot in the 60s. But I don't remember any racial tension in high school. It was going on a lot of different places. In fact, it was in the 60s that Detroit experienced its riots in the summer of 67. I don't remember a lot of racial tension in high school. That's a good thing. For years in high school, I took the bus. It was a two route trip. I had to take the bus on West Chicago to get to Grand River, and then take the transfer to a Grand River bus to get me down to high school. The high school was right off Grand River, right downtown Detroit. So that was kind of interesting. The bus on Grand River went past the old Olympia Stadium. It's where the Red Wings used to play. There were concerts there. I actually, sometime later, saw Bob Dylan at Olympia. I think Olympia has since been torn down, but there was a lot of activity there at one time. It also went not too far from Motown Studios on West Grand Boulevard. Couple blocks off of Grand River, but pretty close. And it went past the Grandy Ballroom, which probably wouldn't mean anything to anybody outside of Detroit, but another entertainment venue. The 60s was also the time of greasers and frats. If you're from that area, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, maybe you don't. Of course, I was a greaser, long hair. And the frats, of course, had the much shorter hair, and the fraternity boys with their Madras shirts and whatnot. And there was also a contingent of what they called surfers. Everybody wanted to have the California vibe going on at that time. So the skateboarding and mimicking the surfers. I have a skateboard. This is one of the originals. I don't know how good you can see this, but this was my baby. And I remember going down Derby Hill on it. There was not too far from our house was where they held soapbox derby races back in the day. And my brother and I took our skateboards over to Rouge Park and did Derby Hill. First time down was great. Second time down, not so much. There's this thing called a wipeout. And I went home with bloody knees that day. Maybe you remember the song Sidewalk Surfin by Jan and Dean. Maybe I'll find that on YouTube, and I'll put a link down in the description. Sidewalk Surfin. Of course, that was the early 60s, and earlier 60s anyway. A little bit later in the 60s, got a little bit more conscious of the Vietnam War and the protests that were going on. There were protests downtown Detroit at Kennedy Square, Cadillac Square, U of M, the colleges, naturally the colleges around the state had the anti-war protests going on. When I graduated from high school, I started college at Lawrence Institute of Technology because they had an architecture program, which was what I thought I wanted to do at the time. My counselor thought it would be a good idea if I started my college career with 3 classes, algebra, trigonometry, and physics. And needless to say, I did not excel in any of them. So I decided that college was probably not for me. So I joined the Navy. I joined up, as I recall, I joined up in November, December, and then actually went in, enlisted in January of 1968. And that was when I left Detroit. I spent a few years, 4 years in the Navy, and when I came back to Detroit. Lived with my parents for a time, and then bought a house in Detroit. Of course, when I came back from the Navy, back to Detroit, we're talking about the early 70s, and that will be the subject of another video. So that will take care of this one. Thanks for listening to my rambling. about my time in Detroit in the 50s and 60s. I know some of the stories are more personal to me. I'm not sure how much interest anybody else has, but I wanted to get them down on the record anyway. So I hope it wasn't too boring for you. Thanks for coming by. Peace and joy from a Motown boy.